Hi, I'm Erin Sarofsky.
And I'm Austin Shaw.
This is Between the Keyframes. Episode 31, Interview with Peter Clark.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Between the Keyframes. We're here with Peter Clark.
Oh, no.
Oh, no?
Well, you have to explain what just happened.
Okay, yeah. So we recorded like 30 minutes and then realized that I wasn't recording. So that was fun. So we had a good rehearsal. Man, we solved a lot of problems in that initial conversation. It's just too bad. Yeah. Too bad it didn't get recorded.
Yeah.
But
we predicted the future of AI.
Yes.
We know where it's going.
Exactly where it's going. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, here we are.
We're here. It's happening.
And we're excited to be talking to you, Peter.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
And we do have a lot to talk about. I know that, we've spoken at the same conference a few times, and we actually all just saw each other at Camp MoGraph.
Mm-hmm.
So that was fun. It's a little hard for us. You could probably tell because we've already talked about this. But no, so we all know each other. Austin and Peter go way back. Why don't you give a little backstory?
We go all the way back to the 2010s. So Peter graduated from SCAD in 2014, which means we probably met in 2012 or something, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And super talented designer, director, and we've become good friends. We're both in the Pacific Northwest. Peter's down in Portland, Oregon. He's been up to visit Western Washington University a few times now. We did a workshop, super fun experimental workshop, and you've also done some class visits. And yeah. So we're really excited to have you here, get to kind of learn more about you and pick your brain. And yeah, that's what's up.
Absolutely. Okay, so why don't one of the things that we talked about that I thought was really interesting, and I find really interesting just about like our field, is how early we get started. What were you doing in high school before you even got to college? Like, what is like your early interests?
Yeah, so in high school, we had laptops for class, and I was like the only art kid in school pretty much. So they set up Photoshop on my computer, and I got hooked on it and then started doing these Photoshop competitions on worth1000.com, which looked a lot like kind of AI prompt type stuff now, but it was a thing where they'd give you a theme, like turn a celebrity into fruits or animals or something, and then you get 2 days to do it, and then you submit what you made, and then everybody judges it, and if you win, you get like points on the website to be able to submit to more competitions. And it was a really good resource for me because a lot of people were super friendly on there, and they'd leave comments which were usually critiques on your work, and they'd say, oh, I like how you did this, but like you could, defocus the background, and here's a tutorial I made on how to do that. And, you'd go to their tutorial and you learn how to do like Gaussian blur or like how to make a vignette. And it was a really great space to learn, and it got me super comfortable with like photo bashing stuff. And I think my first intro to Austin in college was his first assignment in his design for motion class was to composite animals into these different spaces. So I was pumped because it felt like such a familiar space for me. I was like, yes, I am in the right place, the right major, So that was kind of like the early start for me. And I was doing a few pieces. Like I sold my first piece of art in high school. Right before I went to college, I had done a photo bashing thing of like speakers as a hummingbird. And then this music artist, Bass Nectar, ended up buying it. So that was kind of my first beginnings where I thought, oh, maybe I'll do album art. Maybe that's like my future as a, doing still graphic design for music. And it's kind of funny that now I'm mostly doing tour visuals for like music tours. So I'm still kind of in the same
Wow.
space, but
Yeah.
in animation rather than stills.
Yeah.
That's
It's
super
still
cool.
design. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did that whole photo compositing, which we, comping as our kind of shorthand slang term. I still think is one of the core skills for designers. If you want to get that range, that ability to make a lot of different styles, it's like having those comping skills. And it's been interesting. I trying to get graphic design students to be less afraid of Photoshop, right? So I think it's interesting. You're already doing it in high school, you know.
Yeah, my first love was Photoshop too. It took me a little bit to get into Illustrator. I felt like Vector was so limiting, where Photoshop was very like I could go pixel by pixel if I wanted. To me, it was almost like being a fine artist,
Right.
Yeah.
Like you can do anything in that space,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think I liked Illustrator until I started doing motion graphics and then realized,
Right.
the whole pipeline there, and then it just reignited my love for it.
That's interesting because you were a graphic design major first, but you didn't kind of love Illustrator. What were you kind of mainly playing? Was it Photoshop or InDesign, or what were you kind of living in those classes?
Yeah. It was a lot of Photoshop and InDesign, and honestly, I just loved the practical stuff.
Okay.
Like re-photographing, make some type, project it on something, re-photograph that, and that's like your poster graphic. Like stuff that's not super great for client work. Like if they ask to change something, you got to do the whole thing.
Not very
over again,
procedural.
yeah. But when
Right.
you're in school, it's like you can do, that's like the place to experiment and try weird stuff. And so that was like my happy place with that space. And I did a little bit of Illustrator and started doing like laser cut stuff because the industrial design, like we do those collaborative classes and they'd let us use their facilities. And I loved like physical type or like bringing any vector shape into like a physical existence that I could light and move around. So I feel like that was a lot of like the space I was delving into in graphic design, and the like cleaner vector stuff just never felt like it felt like I couldn't put the personality I wanted to into it. Like it was always just a little too clean.
Right. You want to rough it up a little bit. Right.
Yeah. But then once I started animating, it was like, oh my gosh, this is great. I can bring in all these crazy shapes and change them whenever I want, and it'll update, and it's perfect. Yeah.
Totally.
How does motion and graphic design education fit? And practice, really. But kind of in that, I think maybe looking at the gap in education where motion is maybe missing in the traditional graphic design education. And then I think maybe in some of these motion heavy kind of programs, or maybe some of the design is missing. And you being a person who was a double major, who did both at SCAD, and just curious your thoughts and, maybe this question of what did you get out of your graphic design education that was maybe missing in the motion side? And then we'll flip it the other way too.
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, in the motion design side, I started in graphic design first and realized, I love typography. I loved playing with textures, found a lot of artists that I really admired, like Kyle Cooper, where, they were like bringing, type into physical spaces. So I feel like when I went into the motion design side, I felt very comfortable working with type, working with grids, all the traditional design side stuff. So making a frame was like my comfort zone. It was really easy to make my designs, and then making it move was where I had to, really put my time in. And I think I definitely saw some students like at SCAD that would struggle with the design side. and they could make something move really nicely, but then, if your core design isn't, if it doesn't look good, then you've just got a nice moving, bad looking thing. So
Right.
it kind of, I think
best case scenario.
Yeah.
Right.
And then especially with typography too, typography has all these little minutia to it that, it's just nice to have that foundation. And then the reverse, I guess, in graphic design, I always struggled in graphic design that so often you were making one image and you had to say everything with that image. And I really wanted to tell sequential stories, like something someone could experience and be immersed in. So I wanted to bring in music, have things change over time. And it just felt like that was always missing in graphic design for me. And this wasn't when I was in the graphic design major, I feel like people were just branching into oh, now it's all about apps and web and you're designing for that. And now I think it's even more important for graphic designers to understand motion, because you're making all these previews of how the app's going to move. You're going to show how this screen switches to that screen, and what's the, is it really snappy and kind of blocky, or is it this smooth keyframe animation? And so I feel like it's becoming more important for graphic designers to understand motion. So then you can be a part of that process. You're not just making the design and then you have to hand it off to someone else to make it move. And then you have to go back and forth. I'm no, I imagine that being a nice, smooth thing that slides in, So yeah, I definitely think they go hand in hand now. And yeah, it's really important, I think, for graphic designers to not only be able to establish the visual rhythm of how they lay out everything, but the rhythm of how it moves.
So it sounds like really the timeline, right? That's where my head went listening, is that the timeline, the consideration, awareness, and practical use of how do I actually navigate a timeline? Probably what's maybe missing from the traditional graphic education. And then motion, the kind of foundational training, and like you said, the grids, hierarchy, typography, maybe as and just that design sense, what might be missing from more of a motion centric education.
Yeah, I think the way we think of a graphic design degree is, you have typography as a pillar, you have color theory as a pillar, you have composition and hierarchy, and I think motion is a pillar now. And I think you don't have to be an animator to be a motion designer necessarily anymore. I think to be a designer is to understand how your work is going to appear in the world. And most of the world is moving now, whether it's new media, app design, website design, experiential design, or even point of purchase. There's moving things now, very traditional, and bus shelters and posters, all that stuff moves now, And certainly if there is a still print component, there's usually a moving component. If you go into a restaurant, sometimes it's a digital menu, sometimes it's a print menu, but sometimes it's a digital menu now. So everything has this kind of living component that gets to your point, that is narrative. And if it's narrative, you have, at the very least, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that gets into messaging and hierarchy. And so instead of designing one frame, you should be at least designing 3 frames. Even if you don't really know how it's going to move, at least setting the look for what those 3 frames are doing and being able to have a conversation with the animator that's bringing it to life is very, very important.
Yeah.
Get off my soapbox.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because that graphic design education, that more traditional design, carries through in a lot of your work, right? And I know we've talked a lot about it, and I've listened to you talk about too, even design, even with practical type of projects, and setting up ways using graphic language to set up transitions, even in an analog environment or a practically shot environment. So maybe hearing a little bit about that thinking and practice.
Yeah. I think I was very inspired by Kyle Cooper's work when I think that was still when I was a graphic design major. And I was really worried about having like a darker aesthetic that I like to do because it's a little less, commercially
Commercial.
viable.
Yeah.
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 And I remember seeing him in like history of graphic design textbook, and it was like stills from the 7 titles. It's like, all right, if this guy's in like a history book and is being like shown as like, top tier designer, and like all these people know this titles, then there's like a space for that kind of work.
Yeah, but no, you're right. Like, just because it's like a moodier aesthetic doesn't mean that um, it might be like a limited market, but it's still like, especially if you're interested in the music space or the cinematic space, which is where you've like landed firmly. And even with the brands you work with, they're more, I don't know, like open to that kind of a vibe. I mean, like think about gaming now, the kind of things that can be produced for them. Think about, I don't know. There's like I could probably rattle off a bunch of brands that all would like produce work in your style. And
Game Awards, which
that,
you do. That's like a regular
with that
client,
flavor.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely started to discover the brands where that overlapped, and I think kind of going back to the point of like graphic design background incorporating into motion. I think in graphic design I learned a ton about like brand systems, typography, like setting up that whole system. And then you have like the first freelance client, like the first client that reached out to me directly. It was like, I want you to do your style, was the Video Game Awards. And it was to do a branding package. And like, that was mind blowing to me. And then, he's like referencing all this cool work that's really dark, glitchy, kind of holographic stuff. And then reference like a personal project I did that I did not think anyone would ever like be psyched on, and like, just very dark, glitchy stuff.
That's super cool. It's so interesting. I think a lot. There's a quote from Steve Martin. He was giving an interview, and this person who is clearly a comedian and so desperately trying, I think, to be a comedian, like asking for advice, like what do you have to do to become, known? And he's like, well, it's not going to the right parties. It's not, it's, how do you become visible to like casting agents and these people? He's like, trust me, if you do the work and you're good, they will find you. But you have to do the work to stand out. And it's a much shorter, more simple quote than that. But
yeah, it was something like, I remember, was it like, be so good they can't ignore you? Something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be so good they can't ignore you. And it seems like you've like created a lane for yourself and a sensibility for yourself that like, if somebody's looking for that, they're looking for you.
Yeah. I'd like to echo that, and just say that is something I really admire. Cause I think about, I have, if given the space to just make stuff, I have a certain aesthetic I'll gravitate to, and it's got a certain look and all. But in my and sometimes I do that in my commercial practice, but often in my commercial practice, I'm pretty adaptable generalist, where it's like they come to me and I'm like, I could do that look and I could do that, and I got a range, and most of the practice is that. And you really have carved out like your aesthetic and presented that as a designer director and built, in a sense, a brand and a business around it where people are hiring you for your aesthetic. And that's super cool.
It's amazing. It's wonderful. But it's to that Steve Martin thing, be so good they can't ignore you. Like you created that personal project, and that was that. It like reminds me of Sakani and like all these other like super talented people that just like did their thing, and it like really worked for them. So
yeah. And you see what Sakani's doing now, and it looks like, I remember seeing him at SCAD and the stuff he was doing, and I see that same thread of like how he animates, the type of lighting he likes to do. Like it's all like at SCAD, it was obviously like early Sakani, and now it's like crazy high-end renders, like next level. But it's cool still seeing that he just had that style he loved to do and just embraced it. And now he's like running, it's like a studio within Cash App.
Yeah, that's right.
They started like their own
Square.
their own thing, like a little mini studio. And
Yeah, they
he's
just
like
did that
running
brand
that.
film. It's awesome. But you know
Yep.
what you just
Yeah.
said, I see the same thing with you. Like even when you were discussing about,
Yeah.
the way of when you were doing graphic design, it was more about shooting practical and incorporate. I mean, and it's like, yeah, of course, that makes so much sense. Like I found myself just nodding my head and what you've embraced and some of those the practical effects and it's super cool. It is kind of neat to see those trajectories of
Yeah.
y'all, of the alumni.
I think I would be curious if I was listening to this and I was like leaving my academic, kind of finishing up school. I wonder, like, what was your transition from school into the professional world like? Did you have mentorships? Like, what did that look like and feel like for you? Because, like, people are like, yeah, but you don't just go from school to like doing this amazing work. Like, there has to be some kind of in between, and certainly a lot of time has passed. So you've put in the miles. I would say it's miles. You got to do the
Yeah.
miles.
Yeah. It's that transition was pretty terrifying for me because I had the minor and then ended up doing the double major. I never did internships over the summers. I ended up staying in Savannah to do the classes to be able to graduate at like some reasonable time. So I never really got that like go meet people at studios. I kind of wish I did, but I basically just was in school till 2014, and then I think it was like a couple months before graduating, Autofuss Studio came as part of Commotion, maybe, or they were just there to like show their work.
Yeah, they were doing, I think, portfolio reviews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and then G Monk and Ashley Rodholm interviewed me, and I was, huge fan of G Monk, like saw his like Tron work, knew he was like this crazy high energy director. Um, and I just remember like in the review, he just like grabbed my laptop and like pulled it, like I was trying to show one of my compositing frames from one of your classes, Austin, and he just like pulled the laptop over and was like looking at it super close, and I was so anxious. He was like, "Oh, you made this in Photoshop? Oh yeah, use the brush tools. How do you do this?" And I was just like getting amped on it. So I was like, "Okay, I really like this guy's energy. He seems like very like intense and focused, and it was a lot more attention than I thought I would get in like a portfolio review. I thought they'd like kind of graze over it, be like, okay, cool, you're a practical guy, sweet. We could use that for A, B, and C." But he actually like dialed in and took the time to like nitpick my stuff and like give me feedback. And so then they said they might be doing internships, but were vague. And they said to keep in touch. And I hadn't really set up any other studio connections and was just kind of like hoping maybe that would work out, because Autofuss did all this crazy practical effects work with robots. Like they did the box piece with like the projection mapped panels moving around that was all over the internet at that time. So it would definitely be the ideal. And then I like didn't hear from him, and in classic like student fashion, I was way too nervous to like reach out again because I didn't want to like annoy a producer. Like yeah. And then I think it was like Justin Cohn visited, and I was talking to him about it, kind of stressing. It's like, oh, like you should reach out to him again, reach out to Bradley. And like, so I like, he got my confidence up, reached back out, and they're like, oh yeah, like, sorry, we haven't reached out. Studio's been crazy. And like, ended up setting something up, went out there, like I think it was set up like the month I was graduating. So it just, my brain was like, no, it's not real. Like they're going to tell me it's not going to work out. I'm going to be stuck back home with my parents or something. And then ended up going out to San Francisco for like a 3-month internship, which is crazy because it was like low budget internship in the most expensive city I could possibly
Right.
move to. Never lived in a big city before, did not know anyone who lived there, like beyond G Monk, which I had met for like 20 minutes.
Yeah, I see that you're total fish out of water. You're just like,
Yeah.
crazy.
And
Leap of faith.
yeah. So I just like went all out, like, first month was just insane because everyone there was, super senior. And it was a really weird studio because they're not specific to motion design. They do, a million different things. So they had industrial designers, roboticists. They had all sorts of like grips, PAs, an in-house DP, motion designers, graphic designers, like all
just
these
a lab,
specialists. And then
experimental engineering design
Yeah.
lab.
yeah,
That's
it was just
awesome.
like a warehouse filled with stuff and people just doing, and it was perfect for me coming out of school because a lot of people there stayed late to use the facilities to do their own thing. So like roboticists would stay to build their own little like robots. The wood shop workers would stay behind to like build like a cabinet or whatever. Like there's all this stuff that people could use. They had a music room. Some people would jam in there. Like, so it was a really amazing space to go to right out of school. And it also pushed me really hard because I just, wanted to become part of that community and feel like I was pulling my weight. So like, I remember they were working on a big spot for Audi with these big moving panels that were like glasses and you could see through the car. And like, I remember Chris Berger, Michael Wrigley were both like 3D animators on it. And they were staying super late because like the robots were too heavy with this thing. So they had to change the animation to like, it was all this technical stuff. And I just wanted to kind of be around all of it. So I just like Photoshop, like photo bash things. And then eventually, G Monk's like, oh, like you're hanging out. You want to do like the titles at the bottom, the supers or whatever? I'm like, yeah, I'd like to do that. And, it's not glorious work, but I was like hyped to be involved on like the big, and of course, I think I screwed one of them up. Like there was a spelling error. And then he was like, this is why you always check your work before it goes out.
Yeah.
It was like, so I was,
You got to talk
getting
to.
those like, yeah, I mean, and it's on a small thing, but it was still like,
Yeah.
it was nice to be a part of it. And, I probably could have gone home, at the normal time and not been involved in a lot of things, but I just wanted to be on those projects. And I felt like the way to be included was to stay there and like try and help offload the workload that these like very experienced designers had. And I think that paid off because then they put me on the off titles for Cincinnati, which was like all practical
Huge. Yeah.
type. Yeah. And it was like, in a studio that's filled with all these tools. It was like so fun because I was like, oh, I always want to try vacuum forming. They're like, oh, well, this roboticist built his own vacuum forming table. You just attach a shop vac to it. And then the industrial designer's like, here, I'll show you how to heat the plastic. And then the lead type designer, Rowan, is like, oh, you want a cool typeface? You want that? Oh, I got one for you. And he like shows me this great typeface. I'm like, oh, that's sick. And then they're showing me how to like glue acrylic together to make it tall enough to vacuum form. So I'm learning like all these techniques. And then as part of that, like I knew, Bradley's all about the behind the scenes stuff. No one's filming like, or doing photos of people working. And I had like a really crappy like Canon T2i at the time. So I would just go around in my free time and photograph people while they were working. And it was so fun because I got to learn everybody's techniques, like see what they were making, how they're going about it, get to know all the designers because they're, just chatting with me while I'm like taking photos. And then I get to share that at the end. So it was like a really amazing space to start in. And I remember one of the senior designers was always telling me, he's like, man, enjoy the studio while you can, because I guarantee you'll never work at a place as crazy as this. Like, this is a special place. And it was largely in part because they had just been acquired by Google for the robotics division, but the design division was also under that umbrella. So they were in, which I didn't understand at the time as an entry-level designer, but all the senior artists knew that meant they had this year to coast and do like fun stuff and not worry about getting paid and all that, because like big daddy Google's got like the cash coming in. And then at the end of the year, which I found, this happens in the Bay Area all the time, is, Google came in and was like, oh, okay, well, we want to start incorporating you into the other robotics division. So we want to move everybody to a bigger warehouse and like have a little more say in what you're doing. And then all the designers kind of like, I think I'm going freelance now. And then, the studio dissipated, and then I had to go do what I would consider the real like tough motion work, where I went to like a VFX house and was doing like rotoscoping, putting type on credit cards, spinning around at 3 a.m, like the real
got in the trenches,
glorious stuff. Yeah. And it paid the bills for San Francisco, but it was like, it made me love that studio even more, because I realized how fortunate I was to come out of school and go into a space that was so inclusive and inspiring, and like it didn't like drain me.
And experimental. I wonder how much that fed your experimental. I mean, that seems like that's kind of your nature anyway, but what a place to kind of,
it showed you it was possible.
Yeah,
it was possible. And you've built that, like, cut to now, it's like you're building your own version of that.
Oh, I would love to have I've always had those dreams of like, I want to be a studio owner and have the space. And then, it always, like, I always like talking to studio owners about their day to day, because I feel like, especially the ones I talked to in the Bay that had huge, overheads with the price of that city, like most of them never got to touch the work that their studio produced. And when they got home, it was like family time, and I feel like I would struggle with that. I mean, maybe as I get older, I would struggle with it less, but I know I've struggled with that. Like the idea of never getting to like make things and produce it with my hands and be a part of like the team.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, you got a studio owner right here. You could ask away.
No.
Yeah. Well,
but like Aaron, when I think about what you're doing, I think you're doing it at a scale that is manageable. Like, like robotic arms and all that nonsense. But you've kind of located yourself in a city where you can have space and you can have all this stuff, like, I don't know. I just think of you as like a mad scientist in a big garage kind of making stuff. Is that an accurate description?
I'll get the garage soon. Most of my like stuff is just like
pile behind
me.
Yeah.
Like little,
I see the CRT. I saw the CRT TV.
Yeah, and then I've got a whole closet full of materials. Because I'm just a hoarder with that stuff. I think that's the healthy hoarding. When you're like a practical effects artist, it's great to just have a little room where when you go in, you get to see a bunch of disparate things next to each other and be like, oh, I could shoot a laser at that and that would reflect. And then if I get that in there, that would look cool. And
totally mad scientist. But it's like design. It's like through the design filter.
Yeah.
Totally.
But it's, I don't know how... Because like I get a decent amount of client work, but I don't know if it would ever get to the level where I'm like, I can open like a legit studio and be supported by the kind of the niche space. But again, like kind of going to the point of like, I always want to be kind of involved. So I always would see myself more as like senior animator of some sort at a studio, where someone who's like really good at running a studio and managing people and like gets that satisfaction of seeing like, I'm helping them put dinner on the table for their kids. Everybody, and like create that space, because I know that would be fulfilling for me, but I think I wouldn't be the best fit for like a studio owner. So I feel like I'll keep it small scale unless I meet someone that's like, hey, I really want to run a space. You should be like our
in the mix,
effects like guy and be part of it. And, anything remotely close to Autofuss, I'd get pretty psyched on. But I know that's like a rare space. But Aaron, I'm curious about your journey. Did you go through like the different rungs of like designing, animating, and then realize like, oh, I really want to start running the studio and have people take over animating? Or do you feel like you kind of fast tracked into, I want to start a business and like get straight into that space?
I think looking back, maybe it was a little fast, but didn't feel fast because the hours of work were piling up. I definitely went through the rungs, and I didn't spend as much time on the animation rung, but that's because I think I really had a gift for conceptualization and design. And so when you're making a lot of boards and you're selling a lot of boards, it's hard for somebody to validate putting you on the box to animate something for a few months, because you're making and selling boards. And then I started leading those projects because I could lead the project and make boards and sell more projects. And then I got good at communicating with clients and navigating the process. And because I was kind of in the trenches with everybody, like I understood how people animated things. And it's not that I couldn't animate, it just like wasn't my superpower, but I certainly understood the energy and the time and the craftsmanship and the art of it. So I wasn't making promises that were obscene, so that was great. I never desired to be a studio owner. I think I always saw myself as a creative leader. I always think I wanted to be in creative leadership because I really like looking at this person's really good at that and that person's really good at that and I'm really good at this, and I could like kind of put teams together in a way that would really spark magic for a project. So I was very good at that, and I was also very good at communicating with the client and navigating expectations, and that is certainly a gift. Like just being able to like kind of help control the chaos of production is hard. Like an emotional journey, not even like the making of the thing isn't that hard. Sometimes it goes smoothly. Sometimes it's a little bit like pulling teeth, but eventually you get there. But like, how do you walk a client through those processes, especially when it is hard? It's really challenging. And then, I really wound up in Chicago after school with Digital Kitchen. And then when that was over, I went to New York, which is where I'm from. And I really didn't like being in New York. I miss Chicago, but it was more of a post house city. And aside from Digital Kitchen, where I knew I was not going back to, I knew I wanted to come back to Chicago, but it wasn't going to be working for like film workers or, somebody that was more editorial or more just like traditional, because even though they had like design departments or divisions with separate names and fancy reels, like I knew that was an add-on service and I wanted to be like design led and design driven. And so what drew me back to Chicago was ultimately somebody saying they would represent me, like DK's old rep, and say, I could get you some work, like just start out. And I certainly knew enough people that have freelancers come by and help me if I got in over my head. And so it started small. I actually started with a couple of business partners, but that fell apart like instantaneously. And I think that's what made me, like you said, make the leap into it. And that fell apart really quickly. And I was very lost. And I was very like, what am I going to do? Like, do I become a director on somebody's roster? I was getting offered at a couple really big places, like, hey, be a director. Hey, and I'm like, yeah, but like, I need a team. Like, I can't just be a director at a production company. Like, I need like a team of artists and producers. It was a whole process. And I was feeling pretty lost. And it was only like a couple month overlap between that company but I was still finishing out the work for it. So even though I was, that was winding down and I was feeling like a little lost. Like, what am I going to do? Am I going to have to move back to New York or LA? Right at like the turn of the year, a client that we were kind of doing a little dance with a little bit earlier and nothing really worked out. They called and they said, I got one for you, and it wound up being like a really large job. And I was like, yeah, but I'm not doing the company with these partners anymore. They're like, we didn't come for those guys. We came for you. Just make yourself a company and get it together. Get yourself a producer. So, of course, freelancers, I put a little band together, and that's why the company's name is my name, because I didn't have time to think of something. And I was coming off of something where it seemed like the person might be using my name to get work, even though I wasn't participating in the company. And my lawyer had advised me, like, just use your name as a company name to start. And then that will kind of change the ball game on that side. And so now like I have like the burden of my name to live up to as the company name, because I just like made a logo and put it out there, and it's always just been work, work, work. It's not been branding, branding, branding. And by the time it was time for real branding, people knew the name. So I was like, oh gosh, okay.
Wow.
But yeah, so the desire wasn't to be like, it was to be a creative leader, not a business owner. And I would say the thing I've had to work really, really hard at is kind of accepting ownership of it. You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, if things go right, I get the credit, even if I've not really touched the work. And if things go wrong, even if it's not my fault, I have to come and take the punch. You know what I mean? Like, so like I just, the good and the bad is like all mine to own. But, and then just like really being the front person for your team. So like, throwing money at something, if you need to throw money at something, or extra, what I mean by like extra artists, or like just taking real responsibility over the health of the studio and the work and all of that stuff. And then times where it's like, hey, you don't need to be spending that much money on this thing, like what's going on here. Like sometimes you kind of got to be like a bad guy, but I hate being a person that has to think about that. You know what I mean? But that's what a healthy company is. There's a lot of factors in play that have kind of nothing to do with the work and more to do with, especially as we grow, we're like 30 full-timers, maybe a little more now. And that's just like, that's hierarchy. That's like department leads and young artists and older artists. And it just feels like a lot.
You gotta delegate and trust that everybody's going to do. I mean, and I guess that's part of, I know I've struggled with that at times where it's like, I just do everything myself. But did you ever struggle with that, or were you always just like, okay, I can delegate and I can trust, and I can step in and steer them or course correct as needed?
Yeah, I've gotten better at it. I still like knowing everything. What I don't like is when I didn't see that coming. So-and-so's not doing well. Like, why didn't I hear about that sooner? Like, but I think people want to do their job really well and they don't want it to be my problem. And so, but I think that's a sign that something's going right, actually. It's like people taking ownership of their roles in the company. That does not come easy, I would say, for anybody delegating, and then, when it ultimately comes down to delegating the creative, that was the hardest part, because sometimes you're just like, oh my God, if I just did that, it would just go faster, be smoother, do all the things. But my job is to empower people to do it, not to do it anymore.
Oh, yeah. And it's so satisfying when you do delegate something that you were tempted to do yourself, and then the other person like
exceeds,
does like this amazing thing that you're like, wow, I never would have thought to do that, and it looks awesome. And it just is so. I've had a few collaborations recently that were exactly that, where I'm like, oh, I might do this solo, but like it would be really nice to work with this person, so I'm gonna go for this collab and see what happens. And then they like vend out like all this stuff. I'm like, wow, that is so sick, and I have no idea how to make that. Cool. And now it's like so satisfying that we get to make this thing together, because delegating work is so terrifying when it's like your name is it's your thing that and as a studio too, that it sounds terrifying. That's amazing how you got into it, though. It's like the hero's journey of like where they kind of deny the thing at first, like no, I don't want to be the studio owner, and then it's like you kind of get thrown into it. Like, well, this massive job is kind of forcing you to
the call to adventure.
Start a studio.
Like literally, like it's like passing a threshold. I like remember going to the courthouse in my like yoga pants, being like, I am starting a business. Here is the paperwork. And they were like, congratulations. And I'm like, oh no. Wow. And it was just me. And a lot of it had to do, everything was just calling my lawyer and accountant, being like, what do I do? Like that's what all those people were for. Like my whole life, they just sorted through all that. And even now it just gets bigger and more complicated, more zeros. You're just like, oh my God, it just feels like, not just my family, it's 30 families plus
Yeah.
other people, my clients' families and the freelancers' families and all that stuff. But there, I have to say, like, it's rewarding to hear even just you talking about collaborations, and because I think one of the things that we can do as we get older, in addition to like mentor, and I think some of the things that we can do really well is curate talent. So like curate talent in through your lens is going to be different if I curate talent through my lens. It's going to be different personalities, it's going to be different styles, there's going to be this natural thing, and as you do that. So I think ultimately what a creative leadership is curation of talent and then mentoring talent. And that is, the first step of cure. And then if it's not a right fit, like the worst thing you can do is continue to try and nurture it, because if it's not a right fit for you, it's not a right fit in reverse either. Right. And so that can kind of create a negative experience, longer term negative experience, so, and then it's always on us to be like, it's not working, because they're always going to kind of keep grasping on. So it sucks being the bad guy, but it is when it really hits, it's just like, fuck yeah, I got one. You gotta go, but it's a lot of fishing, and a lot of research and looking and portfolio reviews and checking back in with people and watching who checks back in with you and how they do it and the work they're making over time. And it's not necessarily the work that they show you to start, but then 6 months later, a year later, when you see they're progressing and you're like, oh my God, this person made that in a state school with like no resources. Like what? It's different when you see some of that evolution out of people in a motion media program but it's a whole other thing when you're looking out in the boondocks and you see like one in the wild, that's like my new thing, is like my new thrill is like really getting out there and seeing like who is making something out of next to nothing,
just watching like a bunch of crazy YouTube videos and
taking a 2-year design program here, some school of motion classes, motion hatch. They're just kind of piecemealing it together, or in a 4-year degree, but it's like a graphic design degree and they have almost no animation experience, but they're going out there and figuring out how to, they fell in love with it. So they're kind of cobbling it together themselves, and they're emailing you asking for a portfolio review, and you're just like, okay, keep in touch, put me in touch with your teacher. I'll do a portfolio review for the class, kind of things like that, to see, okay, let me see the context of what this person's working with. That takes a lot of work as a curator of talent, but that's how you get it. That's how you do it. I just gave her away my secret sauce,
Yeah. I always liked seeing, it's interesting with like my progression, because like G-Monk's been definitely like the biggest design mentor for me, like brought me into Autofuss. Like he took the risk of like bringing me in, which like I later on learned that they weren't even planning to hire interns. Like apparently it was more me expressing interest in him, being like, we should give this kid a shot, like just let him come in.
Why not?
And like they were kind of like, 3-month internship, we'll see what happens. So like he took the risk for me, and like we've been working together ever since. I've done so many projects together, and it's been interesting going from like the intern that like it's like the mentor seems like this godlike figure that just like just like blows you away, to now I've known him for almost like 8 or 9 years, I think, and gotten to the point where I'm like sitting on a call where they're talking about hiring a studio to do something, and I get to hear him talking about like the like his logic as to why he picks this studio versus that studio versus like the network he's pulling from. And it showed me so much about like what directors do in terms of curating, because like for his personal work he'll sit down and get on the box and make stuff, but for a lot of the like big work that he's known for, he's largely doing that, like curating designers that he knows, like this UI designer with that VFX artist with this studio is gonna be like magic.
Curating a team.
Like, and it's just like knowing, and also him knowing that like if I put these people together, it's going to look like my style of work. Like he knows they're not going to go off on a tangent. So it's been really interesting, like growing older as a designer and getting more and more windows into that process and kind of seeing how a top tier director like does that kind
Yeah.
of work. Because when you're an intern, you're always like, oh, he sits down and he's working with everybody and he's doing all the stuff, and then you realize like, wow, there's way too much work for him to be involved on that level. And he's also directing like 5 projects at the same time, so it's like you start to see just that, the power of curating, delegating, and knowing when to step in and like show people the right inspiration, the right feedback, but not like handhold. And he's so good at like convincing people to like commit to it, where it becomes like their thing too, where they're like, oh, I want it to be amazing. Like it's part of me now. It's not just like a client
ownership.
job. Like, and that's like, it gave me a huge respect for directors because now, and like studio owners, that because it can be hard to like hype people up and inspire them. So it's definitely like an art form that I hope I can at some point start to master. But cool. For now, working on my practical effects craft.
Well, what do you like about practical effects? What like draws you to them? Is it just the fact that it isn't procedural, that it is pretty organic? Is it the process or the look? Is it the process of making it or the outcome?
I'm definitely, I think it's both, but the process is a huge part of it. And I think that's largely because I did, we had to do like research papers at SCAD on, and this was in the graphic design department. They had us write research papers on specific artists, and they gave me Richard Serra. Knew nothing about him at the beginning of it. And then I'm reading all these interviews about him and fell in love with his work. Like he is such a rad sculptor. And I love that he was so focused on getting people to think about the process of a work by doing, like these massive metal slabs that you walk through and it'll be in a museum. And like, so many times I've gone to a Richard Serra piece and overheard people saying like, how did they get it in here? Like, how did they put that in the museum? How did they bend the metal like that? And because it's just this raw thing, not trying to hide the process behind it. And so it gets people to think about like, how did the artist make this thing? And I love that with practical effects, because people look at it and they'll be like, oh, that's dust. Oh, that's a little tiny thing, not a big thing. And you're filming it with like a lens really close up. Like they start to like notice things. And I love that then people get that moment of like, wow, that's real. Like that's something like in the world. And like for me, it's just this constant like, wow, like physics and science, like there's so many cool things happening in the world that I'm overlooking constantly. And it just like reignites my love for like the environment around me. And I think if the projects I'm making can do that on a small level for people watching it, that's like a huge win. Like I love the idea of getting people excited about the environment around them when they watch a piece, because we're so continually moving into like strapping screens to our faces and kind of like separating from a lot of our environment. And then so process wise, it's like super fun for me because I'm finding all these cool things and playing with materials. But then also there's a facet of it where I wouldn't consider myself a super technical animator. So things like 3D software, like I was learning Unreal Engine, that was like the most dense thing I've tried to learn in a while. And so it can really hinder a lot of my intuition on like animation choices because I'm struggling to get
serendipitous. Like, it takes the serendipity out of it.
Yeah, you lose the flow. It's hard. Yeah.
Some people can really do it, but it's not the same for if you're tactile.
Like there are some friends that are so comfortable being like, what's this new thing? I'm going to watch YouTube videos about it. And then they're like making cool stuff with it in like 2 days. And then, I feel like for me, analog stuff is great because I still have to do the learning process. Like I've started playing with one of these desktop Tesla coils, so it
Cool.
like shoots little electric
Nice.
bolts, and like I've been trying all sorts of different things to try and build like sculptures that you'll be able to see the bolts come off of it. And that's like a learning process, because like now I know like, oh, if you get this type of wire for jewelry, it's a different type of metal inside that's cheaper, and they're like coating it in the wire that they're telling you it is. Like, seems like useless knowledge for motion design, but now I'm learning it because I'm like, oh, I need to get like pure, copper at like a thinner gauge, and then that'll conduct electricity the way I want it to. And like, so it's got its own learning to it. But I love that then, maybe a project will come up and they'll be like, oh yeah, we want to do something about this product, and it uses like copper to line the thing. I'm like, oh, that's rad. Like, I'm already thinking about copper. Copper as a material has meaning with your product and how I'm generating these visuals. So now like the process has a lot of meaning to me. And just interconnecting it. And I feel like I get that way more with practical effects than I do with digital. And so like, and then the output, I don't have to wait forever to render things and all that. It's like, and now with the newer Macs working with like B-raw footage, it's like, it's so smooth and easy, and just, and I'm getting like anamorphic lenses now, which are like completely changing my love for like practical effects. Yeah. And so it's, I'm investing a lot of stuff in like camera gear and practical effects stuff, but it's so nice that the output has all these things that I feel like in digital you're trying to add in terms of texture and the way that light bounces, and all those little fine details that are just naturally there in camera, the chromatic aberration, the weird textures in the bokeh. Like, I love that stuff's baked in.
It's so interesting. It's like sometimes we get like product stuff and they're like, should we shoot it practically or should we, do it all CG? And I'm like, well, in a way, it kind of doesn't matter. When we do it all CG, what we do is we just we get it going, but then it looks too good. So we're adding things to it to make it look like it was filmed. Right. And then if you fucking film it, you're cleaning it up so much that you're making it look more CG. Either way you go, you're working back towards this sweet spot.
Right.
And and so I think then it becomes about other things, at least in those situations. I think what you're talking about is a little bit more artistic. But I do think that, when you talk about the strengths of one versus the other, oftentimes it's like, well, is it a picky client? Are they going to have a lot of changes? Like, is it something where, they're going to have so many different aspect ratio deliveries that if it is done all CG, it's going to make the pipeline smoother? Is it something where the package could change in 6 months and it's better to not, if it's just done CG and we have the pipeline built, it's easier to just change the label and just send it back through? Like, it becomes much more about like those like very practical questions. But certainly like when you're filming screens and things like that, like you're going to get one thing and you're going to get it once, and there's probably no way to replicate it.
Right. That bespoke
exactly
versus
the same.
Procedural.
It's the CG stuff is definitely much safer for the picky clients, and because I've done some picky client work with practical, like the video game awards. I remember the second or third year I did it, we did like probably like 50 logo variation, and they were all like laser cut logos being lit, and it's like fun because once it's laser cut you can hit it with all sorts of different lights, but then it's like also like, there's a fingerprint, gotta wipe that. Oh, now there's a smudge, now I'll spray it. Oh, now you can see the edge where the spray, and you end up like just cleaning for so long, and then in the end you're like, I just have to roto that out now, or just light it in a different way. And so
there's always clean up.
Has its pain. And so you do get into that mid-range where it's like, oh, I'm saving time on some things, but also losing a lot of time on cleanup and or dirtying up a CG image. But I know in the end, I still love that, like, there's like a specific feeling when you like light a set and it's like this dark
Nothing
room
like
with
it.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just, there's a really sad, and it's like so fun when I ask a friend to help me with that stuff. I'm like, hey, can you come over and just help me, like, just run the fog machine, or like, just like help me move some lights because we need like a moving light source. And then when they see it lit up in that first, like, whoa,
Whoa.
like you just get immersed and it's like,
It's celebratory. Yeah, there's that
yeah,
moment of like, yeah.
yeah. And then like 10 hours later, you're like, yeah, I'm so over this. I want to go to bed. I don't want to put
Totally.
away all these lights.
So where did you learn all these real techniques? Was it in those early days, or is it just something where it just builds over time when you get a new device or a new thing to play with?
Yeah, I was curious too because I know like I'll see you do weird stuff with like steel wool and like lighting it on fire. Like, where does that come
Mhm.
from? Like, where do you just see other people? Are you researching? Are you on sets? Or yeah,
Yeah, it's all over the board. I know with a lot of the lighting stuff, like when I was at SCAD, I had this really lo-fi like green laser where you could run different patterns on it, and a really cheap projector that I still have. The things like somehow survived college, but that was a lot of me like, okay, what if I like project like on a metal plate? I'm like, oh, okay, that looks kind of cool, and then I'll set down a glass of water and that catches the projection. I'm like, oh, I should like project onto water and then I can like displace it or something. Like,
Yeah.
I do a lot of that in school where it was just serendipitous kind of discoveries. And then I obviously learned a lot about lighting, and like I feel like most of practical effects, like a predominant amount of it is just lighting stuff, like figuring out where to put your lights and how to move them in a cool way. And I feel like I learned a lot about that when I started playing with 3D, and they're like, this is a 3-point light setup. I'm like, oh, I could do that practically. So it was kind of a reverse thing there, but then learned a crazy amount of techniques at Autofuss, like that first studio, because that first job with the off titles, everybody was doing practical effects.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I saw someone use a TV screen to light up acrylic. Like one guy did a whole title using that, and I was like, this is
you were like a
blowing my
sponge,
mind that you can
just
just,
absorbing.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it was like, and because immediately you're like, there's all these variations you could do with that, because like you obviously don't want to just see someone do something and do the exact same thing and just like rip off whatever they're working on. But I think it's really healthy to see something and then say, oh, well, I could combine that with this, and that creates its own thing, and you just
Yep.
riff. And that's why I love sharing, like doing the effects demo at Western was really fun, because I get to see the kids going through what I go
Right,
through with
and see
that.
what they
It's like,
come up
oh, here's
with.
a new technique. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, and then I have this material I can combine with that. And they take it to a whole new space that I would never take it to. And then that pushes me to get crazier with my stuff, because I'm like, oh, now they know how to do my special
Yeah.
technique. I have to figure out a new variation. And so
Well, I think
I
that's why
feel,
people resonate with your work, is they see like the joy for the process and like
mm,
that bespokeness. It does feel like a one-off thing that you're never going to see again, and it's for that thing. And I don't know, I do think like you can feel when somebody had fun making something or felt
mhm,
sparks when they were
yeah.
doing it. And I definitely think that's why I resonate with your work. Why do
Hmm.
you, Austin? Why do you love Peter's work so much?
Gosh,
Because you talk about it all the time. He talks about you all the time. It's kind of embarrassing to say out loud, but he's like,
Oh.
well, Peter, oh, Peter. I'm like, okay.
well, I mean, there is that level of craft and just like in design, right,
Mhm.
where it's really considered, but it also is running it through that more organic lens, But it's not purely. It's like there is that seamless transitions between. Whether it's a practical kind of organic setup with lighting, actual lights, but then it can go into a typographic world or even like CG moments,
Mhm.
So there's just like a high level of design, but also with, I guess, that unexpected materials. Yeah.
Hmm.
I love that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I feel like, Autofuss really taught me a lot about that, like combining the digital techniques with the analog, because like
Mhm.
I do a lot of analog work, but you know even like on the show visual stuff I was doing recently, like half of it is like me animating in After Effects to make a pattern that I'm projecting on something. So it
Yep.
still like has a lot of digital components. And I feel like, taking classes with you, Austin, like I learned so much about After Effects and like how to make the digital stuff feel clean and well designed before I, dirty it up and destroy it by like projecting it
Yeah.
on something or running it through a screen and filming it, in a certain way. So, and like Autofuss, a lot of people there were very technical animators, like super good at 3D and After Effects. So I pulled a lot of like techniques from watching them combine the two realms. Yeah. And then like, being at VFX houses, learned a lot about compositing and just, the pain of a lot of VFX process
Mhm.
Right.
that I could incorporate,
Well,
understanding like,
yeah.
oh, that's how you comp those together. I could comp these practical effect shots together in a way, So it's all kind of, I've just observed my environment, I guess, at all these different studios, working with different artists. And then, nowadays it's a lot of like looking at stuff on the internet, Googling like physics, a lot of like cool science experiments, like to teach kids about physics, and they're all, and then I'll add in whatever material I'm trying to use. Like for 9 Inch Nails, we were trying to do like all this like decaying looking stuff. And I was like, oh, I bet there's a really cool way to make like melting stuff, And so I was like looking around for stuff and found like this Russian physics guy showing how you could melt styrofoam with like these different chemicals. And it's like, really random YouTube hole to go down, but it's all to teach kids
Mhm.
about like chemical reactions in classes. And
So I love that
I feel
you're like
those
looking
are
at
things
science
that get me up on.
experiments for inspiration. That's awesome, though. That's so much fun.
Yeah. Well, it's great
Yeah.
because it's for teachers to teach kids. So they explain it really
Really
concisely,
well.
and
Yeah.
they like tell you where to buy the stuff. Like if you look up anything about like cymatics or like metallic, like magnetic reactions, like there's a million people doing like science channel stuff. And then there's like Physics Girl, I believe is her channel. And she like gets deep on explaining like the science behind it, but she also has really cool, like you can just peruse her channel and find a
That's
million
awesome.
crazy things.
I think one other
Check
thing
that out.
that where I think we resonate too is that, just this whole analog digital mashup, and that's a thread that I know for me, my early education was studio art. My undergrad was studio art, and then my graduate was design and learning these digital tools, but always having that comfort, in my own version of remixing, how to remix and where the organic tactility, I think that resonates with people, right? That's just
Yeah.
it's a very human
Mhm.
quality, and then there is the real efficiency of digital production and just finding
Yeah.
different ways to, how do we use both? How do we use them both in ways that,
Mhm.
is satisfying and sustainable? So, yeah. And plus
Mhm.
every time, like, when we get together or you come and do a workshop, it's like, I'm like, okay, now I got to get another lens. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, all this, like, there's that cool microscope lens, was it the Nanoha, I think?
Yeah.
You showed me that and I was like, okay, I gotta get one of these. And then it's like, it's part of an ongoing series where I'm just like, okay, now I want to play with that, and I'll do kind of my spin on these microscope photos and creating fun little type abstractions with them. So it's,
Yeah.
yeah, you kind of keep pushing the experiment and thinking a little differently and literally off the box, or out of the box type thinking and different types of setups, the CRT machine, the analog glitch, super
Yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love when other people pick it up because it just creates a larger community and ideally more, you start to see more projects in that realm, like the
It becomes
Coachella stuff.
more accepted in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the
As mainstream,
Coachella,
like mainstream accepted. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The Coachella tour that I worked on with Human Person Studio, I was using like the analog glitch like the Tachyon Dream Weapon that I have. And I think there were 4 other artists working on the same tour, and all of them had like analog glitch gear. So it's just like this whole little pack of us doing like cool glitchy stuff. And it was like so satisfying to be on that job, because I was like, oh, like this felt like such a niche thing that I'm like, it's rare that I get to work with other people with the gear and I get to see what they do with it. Because you see it on Instagram all the time of people like doing very art driven glitch, and it's usually very like stroby and crazy. And then, you know, I get like this whole team, and it's like designers that come from a design background starting to use these tools. So they're just doing really cool like compositing and like using it in these more like refined ways for these tours. And it's just like, whoa, I never thought of like using the gear to get that result. That's really interesting. They composited it that way, and like it's just awesome to see like the community growing in that space. And simultaneously I'm like, I want to learn something new, because now everybody's getting really good at using this gear. So I don't want to be like pigeonholed into like, oh, he's the analog
stay ahead of the pack.
Yeah.
But it
or
keeps
just
you,
like be able
keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, because like I definitely have the nightmare of being like an artist that is seen as doing one style of work, and that's all I'll ever like. I don't mind if it's the tone of my work is a style, but the technique, like that's why the illustration minor at SCAD freaked me out, because they were like, if you're going to be an illustrator, you have to have a very specific style, so art directors can hire you to do illustrations and they know it's going to look a specific way.
I think that's such an old school model for illustrators. I mean, and it made sense. And I remember the early days where I'd be at studios and that you'd get books from illustrators and it would be that one look. But yeah, to me, I think that was really fascinating and fun to see a lot of illustration majors who were migrating over to motion media at SCAD because they didn't fit in that model of like, I don't want to just do one look. And I'm like, well, you could be a designer for motion because you got range. But I feel like that's one of those real benefits of social, like Instagram, and people who've been able to promote themselves on that they've been able to kind of break out of that model, you know, but it's tough unless you're a specialist. Like being a one-trick pony, I think is really it's confining. It's constrictive. If you're a generalist,
a little bit scary with where the AI stuff is going, just because it seems like the more easily your style can be hashtagged, and like once there's enough of your stuff out there, then it's easier for you or another artist to be like, make, you know, this picture in this person's style. And then, you know, then clients may potentially start undervaluing it compared to stuff where it's like, what do I even Google to get that image or that look? Like what hashtag encompasses that style? And then I'm curious how that'll like affect the scene. If like, I'm hoping it drives a lot of people to get more crazy and like unique with their approaches, where it's like, cool, AI can't copy me because like this thing is not even really on the internet. Maybe there's like 2 other artists that have done this weird technique, and like, you know, it's kind of like there's not enough of it for AI to replicate. But
well, I think like whenever you have like mass information, it overly generalizes and makes it become like a blob of kind of a look. It kind of morphs into one thing. So I think even though like you could do like in the style of, I think it would take a lot of, I don't know. I feel like the AI's, without like the human touch to it, maybe they can generate an image or 2, but if they have to extrapolate it into a piece, like especially a motion piece and not just an image, it is going to fall far short. There's craftsmanship required for that, and that comes from like a lot of life lessons learned, and where that stuff is going to fall flat is with feedback. Like sure, it might make you like your logo spin for you, but now you have how many rounds of feedback? How do you think it's like, unless clients and people can be very, very clear and specific about what they want, and there isn't any mind reading or experimentation in that process, I I don't see the human component being pulled out of it. I do see efficiencies created. I think like, the rotoing, the rotomation, the set extensions, things like that. There will be some crafts and some things that are eliminated. Stabilization, adding, but that's the stuff that we're trying to bang out anyway as cheaply as possible. So like, fuck yeah, make me a tool for that. You know what I mean? Like, so that I can focus more on the art side of it. So I'm thinking optimistically here that, there's only one you and some other people may be doing some stuff like you, but, it's going to be really hard to go through a process and have the process go well and then a desired outcome, like a beautiful piece at the end. That is going to be, at least not right now, not for a while. I don't see that happening. What's next for you?
This year has been kind of funny work-wise. I kind of took a break from a larger project I was on this year, and then have done a few smaller like tour visual jobs. And I've never like consciously taken time off from work before. It was like something, and like I became aware of it because in San Francisco, like I was just talking to a friend that worked at Autofuss when I was there. He was like, yeah, no one takes breaks in San Francisco. Like you can't afford to take a break in that city because it's so expensive, and the mindset of so many people working there in motion is just what's the next job.
Felt like New York was like that too.
Yeah.
And so like you get downtime, but it's never like, oh, I'm going to take this as me time. It's always like thinking about the next job. Don't want to take a vacation because you might miss a gig that comes up like last minute. And then I move out to Portland where everything's significantly cheaper. And I just meet people who are like, yeah, like I'm taking the whole summer off to go climb in like Asia. And then I'm going on a surf trip. And I'm like, oh, like, that's wild. Like, how do you do that? And they're like, oh yeah, I'm just like living out of my van for a little while and that saves me X amount. So like they've got it all planned out, but they're, taking all this time to really enjoy like the place where they live. And that got me reflecting on, I was like, wow, I have just like never consciously taken a significant amount of time off. So after the Coachella job this year, I decided that I'm going to essentially take the summer off to like do bike packing trips, spend time with friends, go on skate trips. Cause the summertime in Portland is like very coveted. Like it's so miserable in the winter. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to like take conscious time to like really fall in love with this city because I didn't do that in San Francisco. And I feel like I missed a lot of like really like amazing parts of that city because I was just always working. So like I'm open to work. Like if a project comes up and the timing's right, I'm going to take stuff on, but it's like for once I'm prioritizing, oh, friends are coming into town. That week is for them and we're going to do these things together. And if a job overlaps with it, I'm not doing that job because like, and I took like a trip with my mom this year. It was the first like one where it was just me and her. So I had like really like nice bonding time with my mom. And it's just, I've definitely noticed like just stress levels and mentality on a lot of things has really shifted. And
so it's like a recharge.
Yeah.
You guys went to went to the Galapagos, right?
Yes.
That's
which
cool.
was, amazing. It definitely was super different than I thought it was going to be. Cause I thought it was going to be these empty islands, just like you go out and it's like you're just in nature. And there's actually like I think it's 95% of each island is designated to like preserved land, and then that other small percentage is just for like the towns being built. And I ended up bringing my skateboard, and there were skate parks on all the islands, which like blew my mind. And like it was like really amazing because I met all these kids there that barely spoke any English. My Spanish is pretty mediocre. So like had these very disjointed conversations, but they like got so excited about my skateboard. Like, have never seen kids that hyped on a skateboard because they hadn't seen one from the US before. So they're like asking, like, how old is the skateboard? Like, how much do those cost in the US? And like, they were like asking to take photos with it, taking photos of it. Like, they were so hyped. So I ended up like donating my board because they all share skateboards too, which was like beautiful that like it's a skate park of kids and they're all just like letting each other use their skateboards. There's no, like, it's these tiny islands where everyone knows everyone. So I left the board with them, gave them some wheels and stickers, and one of them has me on like WhatsApp. So we were chatting and they were like asking if I could like send more boards. And so I got in touch with one of their parents, and we're coordinating like getting donations to get them a bunch of skateboards there in the Galapagos. And like, that's been something like been like, I think wanting to do for a long time, like some kind of giving back.
Yeah.
Like outside of just like helping people with a motion design project or like doing a demo, like actually just, you know, giving to a community that's really meaningful to me. And the skateboarding community is super meaningful. And just seeing how much like that one skateboard was like life-changing for them, I was like, okay, we gotta like, because the skateboards they had were like not like gonna cut it. Like they were like the little penny boards, really tiny plastic ones that don't even really have a tail, so you can't do most skate tricks on them. So I think that's been a facet that like I've wanted to embrace, but was always like, oh, I got to be doing projects. I need to focus. Yeah. Right. And now I've got free time, so I'm going to use it to go out and like enjoy nature. And now that I actually have time to like sit back and look at everything, I'm like, oh, this is like something I want to commit time and effort to. And I think that's been a nice facet of like taking time off, is like I get to focus more on like me outside of like my identity as a designer.
Yeah, you're like nourishing yourself. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, do you have like a GoFundMe or anything up where people can help you?
So this was like, I was just kind of doing it through Venmo because that's what the contact and I just like posted on Instagram, like, hey friends, like if you can donate anything. And, you know, a skateboard usually costs like $250, $260 in the US. I'm not sure what it's going to cost for them to buy it in the Galapagos, but like, I think I've gotten almost over $1,000 in donations from friends and like people from like all over the place. Like some folks that skateboard, some that are like friends that I just worked on design projects with, and we're like, oh, hey, I want to like help these kids out. And like, it was just really beautiful to see, you know, friends come out to help. And like, I've thought about maybe doing a larger like GoFundMe thing for like, maybe like a larger donation thing to like something around Portland. Like there are a couple organizations here that like are involved with like houseless kids that like do like, they'll go skating together. Like there's a group called Push Movement that does that stuff. So I'm like seeing like how fulfilling it is to be doing these things. I think it's inspiring me to put more effort into like being a part of those communities. And, you know, a lot of that came from like talking with you, Austin, because like I in school would always ask you like, hey, like, what's it like being a teacher? Like what made you choose to be a teacher? And then, you know, talking to you like throughout the years on like why you switched into freelancing and teaching rather than being fully on like just the freelance side. And you know, you mentioned a lot of that, like giving back and feeling like, you know, it's not all about your career. And I think that affected me a lot. I'm like, oh, how am I doing that? Because I freelance solo. Like I'm not at a studio where I can help out the entry level designers. I'm not necessarily teaching. So it's like what, and I'm getting to that age where I'm like, I feel like I can give back and it's not going to like tank my finances. And,
totally. Yeah, you know? Of course. You built a solid foundation. So now, and you know, you're in a place where you're like, you know, your craft, like you're always experimenting, but you know how long something's going to take you, you know, all of that stuff. So you can say, okay, well, if I take this time and do this, then I could take that time and do that. You can really carve up your life like more bigger picture. Cause you're not like diving in on an assignment without any kind of context for how long this is going to take you, what skills you need to develop, so you've kind of arrived in your craft, so you can kind of take a look around you now,
Yeah. I think it was also like interesting getting to the spot where I'm at now, because I think ever since I was like a teenager, I always wanted to work on like a big film, like to make a movie. And I was working on like a short film for a while, like over the past like year and a half with a studio. And it's like kind of at like in a pause right now. But what was really fascinating is the process of it was totally different than what I had imagined like making a movie is like. And, you interact with like producers that are always making movies, and you hear like their logic behind things, and just like, I don't know, it made me realize a lot of like, is making like a film really my big like pinnacle goal as a designer? Like maybe the energy I'm trying to put in, because like films really are like the big things that inspired me outside of like music performances that like really make me feel something. So I always was like, I need to make a film, because that's where I'll get all the emotion out. And but then I think this year was also like that pivot of like, that like the industry of making movies is way different than I thought it was coming from the outside. And once you see kind of the inner workings and like all the stuff that goes into it, it's like, it's almost like running a studio where you quickly get into, the like delegating things, managing a lot of things. You're like, wait, I thought I was going to like sit down and like make a lot more. But, it was kind of like a little bit of a realization for me. And I think that also pushed me into the like, well, if that's not like the big thing that I'm working towards, like what's the thing I want to pivot to? So this summer's been a nice, like, I'm going to step back and
get to ask the question and explore a little bit. Yeah.
And I feel like that's really healthy for like a lot of artists. Like whenever you get to that point of feeling financially stable and you're not like constantly worrying about the next job.
Asking yourself what matters and what do you need, and what's sustainable, and it is different for everybody too, which is cool. Yeah,
because I know people who took a year off right after school and like went and traveled Europe, and that's like their kind of like learning about themselves and their goals and what they want to do. And like I went out of school and I was like straight into work. Work's what I'm doing.
Yeah, work.
It was just work for 10 years straight. And then I was like, wait a minute, I kind of want to take a little like self-evaluation time, and like,
I need to do that.
Super healthy. Yeah.
I want to.
You got to take the, what was it? Didn't Sackmeister's studio do?
Or is it every 7 years it takes a year off or something? Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. I feel like that was in the back of my mind with the year off thing. Was
I'm going to research that.
If Sackmeister does it, maybe I can do it. But I just waited 10 years instead of 7, I guess. But
he probably started at 40, so it was probably 47.
Right. Cool.
That's funny. Awesome.
All right.
Well, I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. I can't thank you enough for sharing all of this. I think there's so many like information nuggets in this conversation that are going to inspire so many people. I think they're going to be just grateful that you shared all that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I know, running a studio doesn't give you a lot of downtime. So I really appreciate you taking time to do this. And Austin, I know you're juggling freelance and teaching the students. So thank you too for setting this up. And
I get a couple of my favorite people together and we get to chat for a bit.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hopefully I'll see you in the winter time for a little workshop.
That's right.
Totally.
That's right. We're going to learn some new experimental techniques. I'm going to have to get a whole bunch of more new gear.
Yeah.
It'll be fun.
Get one of these little Tesla coils and start seeing how you can shock yourself.
Right.
With various objects. Yeah.
So funny. All right. Well, let's do the peace thing that Austin loves to do. Peace.
Oh, wait. Do I need it? Is it this hand?
It's whichever hand you want. You go two if you want.
What's the branding here?
Thanks for listening, and see you on the next Between the Keyframes.